There is a story that needs to be told, a story about a soda brand that once sat on almost every grocery store shelf in America. Today, if you walk into a store and ask a young person under 30 years old about Dad's root beer, they will look at you with confusion. They have never heard of it. They have never tasted it. They do not know that this brand was once loved by millions of American families. This is not a story about a company that made bad products. This is not a story about a brand that failed because people stopped caring. This is a story about how money, ownership, and business decisions made in offices far away from ordinary people slowly erased something that once mattered. This is a story about capitalism, capital, and how the most successful brands are not always the ones with the best taste or the best history. Sometimes they are just the ones backed by the most money. In 1937, a man named Ely Klapman created Dad's Root Beer in the city of Chicago. It was not a fancy drink. It was not trying to be cool or trendy. It was simple, wholesome, and affordable. The brand positioned itself as America's family root beer, the kind of drink you would give to your children at a family dinner, the kind of drink that represented good American values. And people loved it for exactly that reason. By the 1950s and 1960s, root beer was booming across America. Root beer floats were a summer tradition. Root beer was served at diners and ice cream shops. Brands like A&W restaurants became famous, and later the giant companies like PepsiCo and the Coca-Cola Company began to see the opportunity in the root beer market. These massive corporations began turning soda into a national business empire. Dad's Root Beer was there too, part of this growing industry, sold in stores across the country. But Dad's was different from the other brands in one very important way. While Coca-Cola and Pepsi and A&W were building massive distribution networks, buying trucks, building bottling plants, and controlling how their drinks reached stores, Dad's Root Beer relied on something different. Dad's depended on independent bottlers, smaller companies that made and delivered the soda to stores. This might sound like a good idea at first. It meant Dad's did not have to spend as much money building its own factories and delivery system. But in the world of business, there is a very important rule that Dad's root beer would learn the hard way. Whoever controls the shelves controls the money. Whoever controls how products get to stores controls the entire business. Distribution is capital, and capital is power. Dad's root beer was about to discover that lacking this power would eventually lead to its slow disappearance from American life. But the real problem had not even started yet. The beginning of the end came when the soda industry changed completely. By the 1970s, selling soda was no longer just about making a good drink. It became about making smart money decisions. The big soda companies understood something important. They needed to control everything. They started buying bottling plants. They bought trucks. They signed long-term contracts with stores. They were not just selling drinks anymore. They were controlling the entire supply chain from the factory to the store shelf. Think of it this way. Imagine two lemonade stands on the same street. One stand owns the street itself. It owns the corner. It owns the refrigerator. It owns the delivery route. The other stand rents a small corner from someone else and hopes that people will buy from it. Now imagine that the cost of renting that corner goes up. Which lemonade stand survives? The answer is obvious. The one that owns everything survives. The one that rents is in trouble. Dad's Root Beer did not own its supply chain. Dad's did not have deep pockets of money saved up. When it tried to compete with the giant cola companies, it could not match their advertising budgets. It could not buy out distributors. It could not afford to lock down grocery contracts the way that Coca-Cola and Pepsi could. Meanwhile, the corporate giants were spending millions and millions of dollars to make sure their drinks were in every store in America. Shelf space became a war zone, and this war was fought with money. Companies with the most money won. Companies without enough money lost. Dad's Root Beer was slowly losing this war, and most people did not even notice it was happening. Then the acquisitions began. This is where the story becomes even more important. Dad's Root Beer changed owners many times over the years. Each time a new company bought Dad's, something changed. The new owners did not look at Dad's as a special brand with a long history and loyal customers. They looked at Dad's as a line on a spreadsheet, an asset on a balance sheet, just a number in their financial reports. For these companies, Dad's Root Beer was not a legacy brand or a piece of American history. It was a revenue line. It was a cost center. It was something to be studied and measured and analyzed. If it was making money, keep it. If it was not making enough money, get rid of it. Every time Dad's changed owners, the long-term investment in the brand suffered. Marketing budgets were controlled more carefully. Decisions were made by accountants rather than by people who understood the soda business. And here is the twist that made everything worse. Every single acquisition drained the brand of resources. The new owners did not invest in Dad's future. They extracted value from Dad's past. They took the money that Dad's was making and moved it to other products. But one decision, one moment in time, would seal Dad's fate forever. In the 1980s and 1990s, something huge happened in the beverage industry. The biggest companies began buying up all the smaller regional brands. This period is called consolidation, and it changed everything about how drinks were sold in America. The big corporations became obsessed with something called efficiency. They wanted bigger margins on their investment. They cared more about profit than they cared about history or tradition or brand loyalty. When Dad's root beer was absorbed into these larger beverage portfolios, everything changed. Dad's was no longer the priority. Nobody at the big corporation was fighting to protect Dad's. Instead, the marketing budgets for Dad's were slashed. Distribution started to shrink. New flavors were not created. Innovation stopped. The company stopped trying to make Dad's better or more interesting. And here is the brutal math that explains why. If you are a large corporation and you have $10 million to spend on marketing, do you spend it on your global cola brand that sells in 100 countries and makes billions of dollars? Or do you spend it on a root beer brand that grows slowly and only sells in America? The answer that every corporation made was the same. Put the money into the products that make the most profit the fastest. Dad's was not growing fast enough. Dad's was not making as much money as the cola brands. So Dad's was deprioritized. This did not happen overnight. There was no big announcement. Nobody said Dad's root beer is being killed. It was much quieter and much crueler than that. It was a slow financial suffocation. It was a brand being quietly abandoned by its owners while consumers barely noticed what was happening. And by the time people realized that Dad's was disappearing, it was already too late to save it. As the years went on, shelf space in stores became harder and harder to find for Dad's root beer. First, it was still there, but it was not in the best position. Then it became a secondary option, something customers might buy if their favorite brand was sold out. Then it became a niche option, something only older people remembered. Then it became just a memory. Meanwhile, the competitor brands with strong capital backing were expanding internationally. They were selling root beer and cola in countries all over the world. They were growing bigger and bigger. Root beer as a category did not disappear from America. You can still buy root beer today. But Dad's dominance was gone. Dad's was no longer the brand that people thought of when they wanted root beer. The harsh financial reality is very simple to understand. If a brand has history and good products but does not have capital support, that brand will slowly lose its value. The people running private equity companies and large corporations do not think about nostalgia or history or tradition. They think about return on investment. They think about profit margins. They think about whether the brand is hitting its target numbers. If a product does not hit the target margins that the company expects, the money stops flowing to that product. The resources that could help the brand grow are moved to other products instead. The brand slowly fades. This was not about taste. This was not about whether Dad's root beer tasted good or bad. This was about capital allocation, which is a fancy way of saying where the money goes. In finance and business, money always flows to where the growth is fastest and the profit is biggest. Money does not flow to brands just because they have a long history. Money flows to brands because spreadsheets say they should. The fallout was devastating but quiet. As shelf space tightened, Dad's became harder and harder to find. Younger people grew up without ever seeing Dad's in stores. They never developed a taste for it. They never had memories of drinking it with their families. The brand slowly disappeared from the consumer consciousness. A whole generation of Americans had no idea that Dad's root beer had ever existed at all. This teaches us something very important about modern capitalism and how business works today. In modern capitalism, the things that matter most are not always quality or history or loyal customers. The things that matter most are distribution power and capital strength. We see this pattern everywhere in American business if we look for it. Small local banks are swallowed up by huge national banks. Family-owned stores are replaced by big chain stores. Startups are bought by huge tech companies and then quietly shut down. When ownership changes, the priorities change. When capital shifts, visibility shifts. When a new owner takes control, The future of the product is suddenly uncertain. Ask yourself this question: how many brands do you love today? Why do those brands still exist? The answer is often that investors still see growth potential. But what about the brands you cannot find anymore? The answer is that the spreadsheet said to kill them. The numbers said they were not growing fast enough. These brands did not fail because they made bad products. They faded because owners decided they were not worth investing in. Could this same thing happen again in another industry? History says yes. It is already happening. Every year, brands disappear from store shelves. Every year, companies consolidate and become bigger. Every year, the same pattern repeats. The brands with the most money behind them survive and thrive. The brands without capital support slowly fade away. So what does this tell us about Dad's Root Beer specifically? Dad's Root Beer did not collapse in some dramatic scandal. It was not destroyed by a huge mistake or a terrible business decision made by stupid people. Dad's was overtaken by something much more powerful: capital concentration and corporate strategy. The company was systematically deprioritized by owners who did not understand what they had. Sometimes in business, companies do not die because of bad management or bad luck. Sometimes businesses fade away simply because they are outspent by competitors with more money. Dad's Root Beer is proof of this hard truth. The brand had loyal customers. The brand made decent products. The brand had a long history in America. But none of that mattered in the end because the brand did not have capital. The brand did not have owners who were willing to spend the money necessary to keep it visible and competitive. The brand did not have a distribution network powerful enough to fight against the big corporations. So it faded. This story about Dad's Root Beer is not just about soda. It is a window into how modern business works. It is a warning about consolidation. It is a lesson about capital and power. It is a story about how the companies with the most money shape what we see in stores and what we buy with our money. When we walk into a grocery store today, we are not seeing the brands that make the best products. We are not seeing the brands that have the most loyal customers. We are seeing the brands that have the most capital behind them. We are seeing the results of decades of consolidation and financial strategy. We are seeing what happens when a few huge companies control almost everything. Dad's Root Beer faded not because of bad luck or bad management, but because of bad capital strategy and bad luck in terms of ownership. It was owned by companies that did not care enough to fight for it. It was deprioritized in favor of other products. It was slowly starved of resources until it disappeared. This same pattern is playing out in other industries and with other brands right now. The question we should all be asking ourselves is, what brands will we lose next? And is there anything we can do to prevent it? The answer might be complicated, but the story of Dad's Root Beer shows us that in modern capitalism, sometimes the best product does not win. Sometimes the product with the most money behind it wins. Sometimes, brands that once mattered to millions of people simply fade away. Dad's Root Beer is a memory now, a reminder of a time when things were different, a story about how money and ownership can erase brands from memory.